Well, hello, and after a dramatic week off, we're back with week 21/22 of history. Sorry for the abrupt loss of class last week, but it would figure that just as soon as COVID-19 moves from pandemic to endemic, I would get it. Anyway, felt rough for a few days, but otherwise okay. Again, not the worst sickness I've ever had by any stretch, but I am not going to get into that, but I'm back. Took a few days to get my energy back, but here we are. I'm going to try to combine two lessons into 1 week here, and in the process, I'm going to try not to get into too much detail. But I don't want us to miss anything because we're heading into, all points of history are crucial in their own way, but we're getting into some real meat and potato stuff here that will be the foundation for a lot of stuff we talk about the next final 2.5 months of the class. The lesson number 58 looks at a couple of angles of church history, which, of course, since the medieval church was such a force in the world, church history is world history. We're going to begin with the name Peter Bruet. He was a priest in southern France in the early 1100s, and like most priests, devoted to studying the Word of God. And we've talked about the fact that the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, which was used by the church for about 1,000 years, it was considered to be the inerrant Word of God, and it was to be regarded as such. And again, the only one that could read it were priests. Their literacy was still very, very low in Europe, despite the efforts we talked about some of these great leaders to try to expand educational opportunities. The feudal system really began undoing a lot of that work, because in the feudal system, if you were born a peasant, you didn't need to read, you just needed to work. And the feudal system, with its machinations, did not encourage education, and so literacy, again, dropped down to near nothing. The upper clergy were the ones who were mainly, even among the clergy, the ability to read was not unanimous. It was predominantly the upper clergy, the better educated, that was able to read the Bible, and they felt the responsibility to read it and to then explain it to others. Many of the clergy believed that access to the Bible would prevent the formation of, or limiting access to the Bible would prevent the formation of cults and sects, and they would get together and preach heresy. Basically, we'll read the Bible for you and tell you what's in it, so you don't go off getting any wild ideas. You can see where that could very, very easily be abused. Getting back to Bruet, he was a scholarly priest who could read, and he chose to teach and preach from the Bible, and he had interpretations of Scripture that were at odds with the Roman Catholic Church. He was dismissed from the church, but he continued to preach, even without the church's sanction. He began to develop followers called the Petrobrusians, and he may not have always handled the Word of God accurately. That's one thing. Again, that's one of the chances you take with having people being able to read the Bible for themselves. They are going to sometimes come to different conclusions than you. One thing, Bruet did not value the Old Testament like he did the New Testament, and that's a debate that churches are still having. There are many very moderate people calling themselves Christians, and they are Christians, who have a hard time explaining the Old Testament. Now, there are parts of it that are very hard to reconcile. Bruet led his followers in rebellion against the medieval church. He took it pretty far. He actively advocated for the destruction of churches. I think we can all agree you can disagree with what the church, capital C church, is doing without having to destroy its buildings. He also, remember the iconoclast controversy? He was very big against icons, and even thought showing a cross was immodest because, in its own essence, the cross is an icon. It is meant to to represent something else. Eventually, Brouet was condemned as a heretic and was put to death, but he was, in his own way, a reformer of sorts before Martin Luther came along. Peter Brouet was out there, no doubt about it, but he was an important foundation for some major changes that we're going to see in the Catholic Church. The second group we're going to talk about are the Waldensians, led by Peter Waldo, wealthy businessman living the good life in France, who accepted Jesus into his life as an adult, and he began to study and memorize the Bible. He developed the belief that the Bible should be the sole authority of a person's life. Now that sounds fair enough to those of us who are Christian and read the Bible. That's not the way the church wanted it, though. They wanted the church to be the center of your life and not the Bible. The church would tell you what's in the Bible. Don't worry about that. The church should be the instrument through which you reach God. Peter Waldo, though, rejected this tradition and personally funded translations of the Bible from Latin, the Vulgate, into everyday language of the French people. Of course, this had to be done by hand. This is a few hundred years before Gutenberg's printing press came along. Hundreds of people began following him, and Peter Waldo evidently was very, very generous with his money, while at the same time vowing to live a life of poverty and obedience. His followers adopted that as well and started calling themselves the Poor Men of Lyon. They were considered a very radical group of believers. The vast majority did not have formal training as priests or monks or nuns. They were forbidden by the church to teach the Bible because they were not taught by the church. Waldo's response is Acts 5:28, we obey God, not men. Well, you can imagine how that went over with the medieval church. The Waldensians, the Poor Men of Lyon, rejected many of their traditions, like going on pilgrimages, recognizing the saints' days. In 1184, Pope Lucius III dropped the hammer down. He excommunicated the Waldensians from the medieval church. Unknown numbers were actively executed for heresy. Despite this, Peter Waldo lived a long life, and a crusade was launched against his followers, who were still around 200 years later. Waldensians still persevere today. They believe in the primacy of the Bible, but also, and here's a phrase you might have heard today, something called the priesthood of the believer. That is the belief that every Christian has the ability to read Scripture on their own and interpret it on their own. The medieval church was, and really to a large part still is, very much about using the priest and the church as intermediaries between you and God. The Waldensians were the first to really want to bypass this idea and to explore the notion that you can have a personal relationship with God. You can see how radical this would have been during the medieval church, and you can also see where a lot of the modern ideas we have about religion, where they spring from. It was radical stuff 1,000 years ago when people were talking about this. All right, let's remain in France, but move to the south side of France, to the castle and the kingdom of Aquitaine, where Eleanor was born, a young, vigorous beauty who became the queen at different times of the two leading nations in the Western Hemisphere. Her lineages actually tracked all the way back to Charlemagne. Aquitaine was a beautiful province in southern France, and she inherited it as the ruler when her father passed when she was only the age of 15. That same year, she entered into an arranged marriage to the Prince of France, Louis VII. She had never met him. Thus was the way of arranged marriages. Shortly after becoming husband and wife, they were crowned king and queen of France while they were still both only teenagers. Eleanor was raised on the classics, and Louis VII did not fit the archetype of the bold, handsome king. He was a shy, quiet man, a Christian, a serious student. Eleanor wrote that he reminded her more of a monk than a king. Louis, though, loved Eleanor. She apparently was stunning, and he was smitten with her. He turned out he ended up joining one of the Crusades. We'll talk about it in a little while. The Second Crusade. They didn't do so well. But Eleanor was actually partly to blame for this in some ways, because she looked at the crusade as an opportunity to see the world for herself and to leave Paris, so she tagged along with the armies. They went to Antioch in Greece during the movement of the crusade, where she met with her cousin, Raymond of Poitiers. Raymond also happened to have great wealth and a strong personality. Again, he was everything that she thought a king should be. Evidently, Eleanor made quite a spectacle in front of Louis VII over her uncle's riches and his military mind and whatnot. Louis the king got so angry at her that he had her arrested and sent home. Wow. Kind of odd, but, to make matters worse, again, Louis and his armies suffered a pretty bad defeat in the Second Crusade, and he came back as, not the Crusader states were now almost all gone. At the age of 29, Eleanor convinced the archbishop to have her marriage annulled because she was able to somehow very sketchily prove that they were fourth cousins. Was this true? We don't know. But she got the church to say, okay, your marriage is now annulled. So at the age of 29, she is now divorced from the King of France. She returned to Aquitaine. Because of her wealthy estate, she was nearly kidnapped twice, and she knew at that point she needed a husband to protect her and to basically give her a chance to govern without having to look over her shoulder. Well, you remember our old friend William the Conqueror of England, the beginning of the Norman line of kings? Well, he had a great-grandson, Henry, who was now the new Duke of Normandy. And they met and evidently hit it off. Henry convinced the King of England to make him his heir, which meant that when the King of England died at 1154, Henry became King of England. His official title, Henry II. Most of them called him Henry Plantagenet. That's a name that would stick in British history for many generations. So Eleanor goes to England. Once again, a queen, this time of a different nation. As a queen, as you would expect, Eleanor took a very active role in governing. One of the things she noticed was that from one end of England to the other, the laws were not uniform. What's legal here is not legal here, and so forth. So she and Henry, working kind of as a team, worked hard to level the law. That is to try to make it a little more uniform throughout the British Isles, and also introduced the concept of a trial by jury, having 12 peers to judge a person's a crime. She was also very artistically sound, and she saw on the British Isle, a lack of art and culture. She brought in minstrels, troubadours, decorators, and really started to focus on resurrecting that old code of chivalry that we talked about in the old Middle Ages, mainly amongst the knights. Her influence expanded on the very thought of chivalry to include not just strong and courageous, but also someone who's tender, humble, chaste, and respectful, almost worshipful of women. So great was Eleanor's influence that you could make a very fine argument that because of her influence, the very stature of women changed a bit. They were no longer exclusively seen as property, but as something to be admired and respected. So, if to whatever degree Eleanor had in creating that perception, that's a life well lived. Now, there were royal troubles. The Archbishop of Canterbury's name was Thomas à Becket. Henry was having some serious issues with him, and evidently kind of screamed out loud, or not screamed, but just moaned out loud, "I wish someone would take this problem off my hands." Well, the nobles who were loyal to Henry killed him. Henry did not want him dead, but he ended up dead, and Henry blamed himself for the rest of his life. Also, that and other events conspired to change him as a man, and he found he no longer loved Eleanor. He started a relationship with another woman, and Queen Eleanor was, of course, devastated with that. She got back at him by taking Henry's sons and turning them against him. So both his sons were now challenging Henry for the throne. Henry knew Eleanor was plotting against him. He also knew that if he divorced her, he would lose the influence he had in southern France at her home of Aquitaine. So he decided to more or less lock her up in a tower, so to speak. He locked her up in a castle in southern England for nearly 15 years. She was allowed some freedoms at Salisbury Castle, and Henry would let her out on special occasions, Christmas or whatever. But Eleanor continued to entertain from her castle prison and to encourage a flourishing of the arts in England. After one of the long crusades, Henry died when Eleanor was 67, and she was, of course, immediately released from prison at the age of 67, and she was not done just yet. She had, two sons. Her son Richard I, called Richard the Lionhearted, became the new king. He left England to join in one of the Crusades, and who did he leave it in the hands of? His mother, Eleanor. She did a good job, too. She still was able to travel, kept close contact with her people in England and in southern France. She had another son named John, who wanted the throne from Richard. 10 years after that, when her second son, John, was now the King of England after Richard died following one of the Crusades, their distant grandson named Arthur was kept hostage at a castle in France. In the Battle of Mirbeau in 1212, King John rescued his aging mother, Eleanor, from Arthur and his knights, as if Eleanor were once again a young damsel in distress. John threw Arthur into a dungeon. That was the last we heard of him. At the age of 82, Eleanor returned to live her final days with the nuns. They called her, quote, "enhancing the grandeur of her birth by the honesty of her life, she surpassed all the queens in the world." So Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, later Queen of England, and the most formidable woman that Europe had seen in many, many centuries. Next, we'll take a look at what was going on with the Jewish population during the early Middle Ages here. The underlying everything that we talk about in terms of the Jews is the fact that the Jews had no home. There was no nation where they could say, this is where we live, etc., etc. So their reputation as sort of a vagabond type people was really cemented during the Middle Ages. They were a people held together by a common religion but without a common homeland. And so as a result, they lived wherever they could, and that could be a little confusing because, quite frankly, they did not know at all times who their friends were. We'll start with their relationship with the Muslims. You'll recall during the caliphs of the Arab Empire, they were mostly respectful of the Jews. They were content to allow Jews to live in Muslim lands, even under some limited Jewish leadership. In the southern part of Spain, Al-Andalus, the Jews were particularly prosperous. In 1066, though, things got different. Spanish Jews in 1066, thousands were slaughtered in Granada, Spain. Some Jews chose death rather than converting to Islam, as some more militant Islamic forces began taking over Islamic lands. In terms of the Christians, generally speaking, Christians were tolerant, again, of Judaism. One Jewish historian wrote, if it had not been for the Catholic Church, the Jews would not have survived the Middle Ages in the rest of Europe. Unfortunately, there were parts of Europe under Christian rule that were not that accepting of the Jews. Constantine, of course, the original leader, Roman emperor to convert, banished rabbis from Rome. In 581, one ruler told Jews to convert to Christianity or they would have their eyes torn out. In 1313, the Council of Zamora in Spain ordered Jews to wear a gold badge. That should be seen as a precursor to what was seen during Nazi Germany a few centuries later. In other places, they were required to wear hats or veils. By doing this, of course, Jews were quickly identified, and of course, they were more easily mistreated. In England, things got particularly bad under King John. Remember, the second son of Eleanor of Aquitaine? He was quite cruel to Jewish people. In 1210, he ordered all Jews to go to prison, and he took their money. That kind of thing. By 1290, King Edward I, basically, this is Edward Longshanks, if you've seen the movie Braveheart, he's portrayed there. He told the Jews to leave England because they no longer contributed to the economy, which is kind of hard to contribute to the economy if you're being constantly thrown in jail for no reason. Many Jews tried to drown trying to cross the English Channel into France. So on the British Isles, the early Norman kings and Plantagenets made no bones about it. They were not interested in Judaism. There were some German kings who thought they had the authority to burn Jews, to show them mercy, save their lives, and take every third cent of their property. Another problem for the Jews, of course, the Crusades. Some crusaders were, of course, very sincere in trying to return Jerusalem to honor God, but many, of course, were completely out of control. Some went through the Holy Land, killing everyone indiscriminately, including Jews. And, of course, making all this even more complicated, the fact that Jews didn't always agree with each other on Jewish doctrines and practices. There were violent disagreements among sections of Judaism that led to Jews excommunicating each other and persecuting each other, just like the other religions did. One of the most famous Jewish scholars of this time was Maimonides. He was born in Spain. Most say it was his brilliant writings that set him apart. He took all the books of the law and the Talmud and organized them into one volume. At this point in history, you can imagine, for the Jewish people, what separated them from the other people was the law of Moses. No one else had this. This was an identifying characteristic of Judaism. And they had no homeland, they had no temple in which to worship, but they had the law. And Maimonides putting that law into a Bible of sorts that could be carried around was a big part of Jewish culture being able to survive. As a result, Jewish family units, just the immediate families, became very strong, very crucial. There was very little divorce or crime or heavy drinking among Jewish populations. Again, they had to huddle for closeness just to survive. And The fact that Judaism is still thriving today tells us that they weathered the storm very well. All right, the next segment we're going to talk about is two leaders who had a very unusual relationship. They never met face to face, but they became fast friends during the Crusades on different sides. Remember Richard the Lionhearted, Eleanor's oldest son? He was one of the leaders of the Third Crusade into the Holy Land. Saladin was the leader of the Muslim occupying forces at the beginning of the Third Crusade. Saladin was a Sunni Muslim who was Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and was probably the greatest military mind of his kind, certainly the most successful general since Genghis Khan. In 1187, he recaptured Jerusalem, the city that the Christians took from the Seljuk Turks. You'll recall Jerusalem was the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one of the four Crusader states. And of course, as you can imagine, the Christians were very demoralized at this. The gold cross was taken off the Dome of the Rock, and it was once again, the building was turned into a mosque, a Muslim place of worship. And, of course, when word got around, time for another crusade. Basically, the effort of Richard the Lionhearted to try to take back Jerusalem in Crusade number 3. What Richard didn't know was just how difficult this was going to be. Not only did he know how hard, from a military standpoint, it was going to be, he also came to respect Saladin, and Saladin came to respect him. Just an overview of just some of the stories here. They were both fierce, both of them, and merciful. Saladin's campaign against Jerusalem, he said to the Christians, "I believe that Jerusalem is the city of God, as you also believe, and I will not willingly lay siege to it or put it to assault." So he was able to capture Jerusalem by basically giving the Christians a chance to leave in peace. They refused to surrender, so fighting took place, but still Saladin had mercy on his foes. He released many husbands and fathers who had been captured. He gave freedom to Christians and Jews alike to enter the city on pilgrimage. So much like the first Arab caliph rulers of Jerusalem, they were somewhat respectful to Jews and to Christians. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time was Frederick Barbarossa. His troops tried to recapture Jerusalem before Richard the Lionhearted came. They were cut down and were beaten badly. Again, Saladin was a very, very good military commander. Richard and Philip Augustus of France joined forces for what we call the Third Crusade. Philip fell ill with fever that left Richard pretty much on his own to try to take Jerusalem back from Saladin. One of his first offers was to offer his own sister in marriage to Saladin's brother. This was rejected, but again, it was an interesting offer nonetheless. Saladin tried to make peace. He offered Richard a plan that would give Christians all of the cities that they already occupied in the Holy Land and half of Jerusalem. After some thought, Richard rejected the idea. He decided instead to attack the Muslim holy city of Jaffa in 1192. The story goes that Richard got so excited to lead his troops into battle that he fell off of his horse, fell into a river, and stood waist deep in water in the river and waved his men over that way. Saladin evidently saw this from a distance and thought it was unkingly to lead your army without a horse, so he personally sent Richard a horse to lead him into battle. Richard thought this was a great idea, and he thanked him by sending him a gift of highly trained falcons. An odd mutual admiration society developed between these two leaders who were literally on opposite sides militarily. As it turned out, they grew so distantly fond of each other that neither wanted to win at the expense of the other. So in 1192, they agreed to a 3-year peace treaty. The Crusaders moved the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Tyre, and they were allowed to occupy some other cities along the coast. And again, being true to his word, Richard said, okay, 3 years of peace. In 3 years, though, I'm coming back to take Jerusalem. Saladin said, okay, let's give it a shot. Saladin never had a chance, though. He passed away the following year. Richard, as it turned out, died 2 years later. But it was still interesting, the odd mutual admiration society that these two very, very similar leaders developed with each other and how it turned out. Let's go back and talk a little bit about, again, that sometimes not correct marriage of history and legend, and how literature dealing with history sometimes is not very accurate, but no one seems to care because it's entertaining, and there are great truths in that. We are talking this time about the legend of Robin Hood. We all have our image of Robin Hood in a green outfit, tights, arrow, Maid Marian, Friar Tuck, Little John, Sheriff of Nottingham, rob from the rich, give to the poor. The facts of Robin Hood, the person, there's really only one hard fact. There is a cemetery in Yorkshire, England, with a tombstone that reads, "Here underneath this little stone lies Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. Never archer was he as he so good, and people called him Robin Hood. Such outlaws as he and his men will England never see again." And the year is noted as 1247. If the tombstone's credible, we can conclude several things about the medieval image of Robin Hood. He lived and died in England. His real name was Robert. He was the Earl of Huntingdon, so he was a member of nobility. He was a good archer, and he had a nickname, Robin Hood. He also had a following of men. We also can discern that Robin and his men were considered to be outlaws, and of course we have his year of death, 1247. That's a lot of information for one tombstone. Beyond that, though, most everything you know or think you know about Robin Hood is legend. It was created. The legend of Robin Hood sort of functioned in its own way, much like the legend of Beowulf in the early Dark Ages. The legend of King Arthur, who was an actual Celtic king who beat back some of the Goths and Saxons and Angles attacks. And the legend is about 95% legend and 5% fact. Lots of fiction going. Most everything that you've seen about Robin Hood has been added on through the years by people who wrote about the Earl of Huntingdon and whatnot. And much like with King Arthur and with Beowulf and whatnot, people add on to it over the years, and it begins to take on a life of its own. And the good thing, though, is quite often in these historic accounts of fiction that become fiction, the central idea behind the creation of this hero, this legend, usually stays pretty well intact. The idea that Robin was a sort of a lovable rogue, an outlaw who had a band of merry men. The very central parts of that point of the story remained intact. Well, all the stuff that was added to the legend of King Arthur over the years, the central point of King Arthur and all that he was and represented stayed true. And again, mentioned it before, I'll say it again right now. Cultures need heroes. We need heroes. We need avatars to represent all of the things that we see as important, the values that we hold dear. And sometimes you get that by reporting the facts. Most often, though, you take a little fact and you make a big story around it to make this person, this image, the avatar for all that you hold dear. It's what happened with Beowulf. It's what happened with King Arthur. It's what happened with Robin Hood. Very briefly, let's go to Japan and see what is happening in the Pacific Island nation. At the same time, all this crusading stuff is going on in England. And you'll be amazed at well, how different it is, but also how similar it is. The early Middle Ages in Japan was the era of the shoguns and the samurai. They were the lords and the knights of medieval Japan, and it was a fairly prosperous, peaceful period of about 600 to 700 years. You'll recall the original Japanese saw themselves as descendants of the sun goddess. Prince Shotoku, the founder of Japanese civilizations, was the first to unite the island under one rule, and he helped spread Buddhism to the four main islands in Japan. The Fujiwara family had the greatest control over Japan and led to, again, a very long period of peace and prosperity. The shoguns and the legends and the ruling around them really started in the year 1191 by a warrior named Minamoto Yoritomo, or Yoritomo, I should say. His name, he took the title of shogun, which in Japanese means conquering general. The odd thing is, as he took the role and title of shogun, he let the emperor stay in the emperor's place. The emperor of Japan kept their rightful position and was treated with great respect, but as a figurehead. Much like the King of England or Queen of England today has no real power, but they are still revered as a queen. The shogun had control over finances, the laws, the military, and thus had the real power in Japan. This relationship between the shogun and the emperor was successful enough to continue for several hundred years. During the period of the shoguns ruling Japan, the samurai became the Japanese equivalent of the medieval knights in Europe. They were a class of people that included women and children at times, but they served their kings under the feudal system in Europe, and the samurai served the lords and shoguns of Japan. Much like the knights of medieval Europe developed their own customs, so did the samurai. Distinctive dress and accessories, the kashimono, kamishono, that they wear over their kimono with exaggerated shoulders. The samurai was expected to have two weapons, a katana and a wakizashi, a short sword and a long sword. And the armor of the samurai warrior was equally impressive. But more so than their fighting prowess, samurai were also expected to be smart and artistic, very refined tastes. They were trained in the intricacies of the Japanese tea ceremony. They were supposed to be able to write and recite poetry. They were expected to... personal hygiene was also a big thing with samurai. They were expected to always be, quite literally, clean. The top knot, to take all loose strands of hairs and put it in a top knot, was also a samurai trait. They lived by a code of honor called the Bushido. It meant way of the warrior. And under the Bushido, they were expected to be honest, respectful, considerate, loyal. Sounds a lot like the European Knights, doesn't it? So, thousands of miles away, on different continents, this class of knights rose up in Europe. The class of samurai rose up in Japan with very, very similar codes, with very similar ideals of what the right sort of behavior is supposed to be. Japanese took it a step further. That Bushido code also called for something called seppuku harikari. If you dishonor your master, you were expected to shove your sword through your stomach and commit suicide. European Knights didn't come up with anything quite like that, but there have to be some differences. I hope we've covered an awful lot in this series of stories by necessity. We'll talk more about it on Monday, and hopefully I'll be able to talk an hour without having my voice crack by then. Won't have to if you ask a lot of questions, though. Anyway, we'll see you on Monday.